Hey, everybody. Sorry about that. We were having some technical difficulties on our end. I hope folks are able to trickle in now. Um, Thank you all for registering and attending for our practical tips for identifying or for resolving identity sprawl within AWS using Access Analyzer. We've got Jeff Moncrief here from Sonnery Security and James Berthotti here from Ladio Tech. We're going to dive in, show y'all first how to resolve this issue with Access Analyzer, and then even with Cloud Permissions Firewall, Sonnery's own tool. So I'll hand it over to the guys. Drop your questions here in the chat. Best question has a chance to win a Nintendo Switch today. So be sure to drop your questions in there. We'll get to them at the end. James, Jeff, I'll hand it over to y'all.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks.
Thanks, folks. Certainly appreciate everyone joining. Thanks for your patience when we got everything organized to go live with you all here. As Matt said, I'm Jeff Moncrief. I'm the field CTO and I run the SE team here at Sonnery. I've been focused on securing public cloud workloads full-time for about 10 years now, 4 of it here at Sonnery, really focused on identity security inside the public cloud, helping folks, many organizations get to least privilege. I'm super excited about this session. No slides today. It's all real. James, I'm super excited about his segment. We're doing a real live demonstration inside his cloud that's running his website with an AWS backend, and I'm going to be showing you some live cool things that we can do with the Sonnery Cloud Permissions Firewall as well. So super excited about this one. James, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So my background, everyone, is from DevOps into cloud security, and I've been at an MDR provider, ReliaQuest. I was at a startup doing SOC 2 automation product, and then most recently was at PagerDuty doing FedRAMP and stuff. And so I've been in a lot of different sized AWS accounts, from really small ones to really big ones, and that is why I am happy and sad at the same time to talk about identity sprawl, which is probably one of the hardest issues that exists in AWS. Sometimes I wonder if there would even be a market for identity products if AWS just had a usable identity system. But piece after piece, it chooses to be the most complicated thing that you can imagine. And so I'll even answer Marcus's question here, even though I'm not a Sonnery employee. But just to me, what makes the Sonnery piece stand out as far as approaches to this problem is what we're going to be talking about today, where it's going through Access Analyzer and what it looks like to try to do this least privilege thing. Because over the course of my career, like I followed the way that a lot of security engineers tend to think about this stuff, which is, oh, if I just had visibility into all of my identities and my permissions, then I could go and craft these perfect policies and deploy them across my organization. But it's only after years of trying that at different organizations, and then even a more advanced approach of like, what if we did this all as IAC? We had perfect guardrails around our Terraform deployment. We created least privilege policies that people could adopt. We had just-in-time access with workflows for access. None of these things holistically solve the cloud identity issue. And there's very few vendors that have like flipped the problem on its head the way that Sonnery has, as far as what if instead of trying to help people create these like perfectly crafted least privilege per person policies, we instead blocked people from what we know is bad, and that we know that stuff they shouldn't be doing. And we use that as an entire permissions model for blocking, whether it's unused access, where you can just block someone and then re-enable it on the fly, or you can take these broad like lockout regions, lockout accounts. And so it's a different way to actually achieve like marginal security improvements, as opposed to trying to make these like giant swaths of changes all at the same time. So with that, I'm going to hop into our demo here. And this is my real AWS account, which is surfacing the backend for this site that I'll talk about. But really what I want us to remember about this account going through this demo is that it is a super, super small account. And these problems with trying to use Access Analyzer and clean things up really just increase in difficulty over time. And so just to get the lay of the land of what this account is this is my AWS account, which hosts the backend for my Latio list site, where you can go and choose different vendors. So we'll go to like identity, for example. And then all this is doing is hosting Lambda functions for like this basic upvote logic and favoriting logic, and then like ranking the different vendors based off who has different amounts of upvotes and stuff. So that's really all that it is. It's super simple. So if I go into Lambda, you can see there's 3 different Lambda functions doing that stuff. If I go in the DymoDB, which I will now recommend that no one use DymoDB. NoSQL is not as cool as it sounds. Don't listen to the JavaScript YouTubers telling you that NoSQL is cool. It's super annoying. So that is all that is in this account. And from a user perspective, you can see realistically, like there has already been identity sprawl, if we want to call it that, even in this super small account, because it's very realistic to just how development work happens, where typically, especially early on in the cloud, but this continues to be the case, where the CTO or a product person gets this really cool idea. They want people to go and start implementing it. They get a credit card. They get an AWS account. I mean, if your security team's anything like me, you get these just random things out of nowhere that's like, hey, we need a new account for machine learning. And I'm like, okay, like, let's talk about why and what are we going to do and what's the permissions policy. And none of those things actually exist around like helping to plan in advance what's going to happen. And so you just end up with things like this, where I have like identity accounts that have never been used because I just made them for like a demo account for someone. I have all these third-party integrations that are out there to go ahead and try to do different integrations with different providers. I have roles to other accounts that are out there with when they're last used, and typical mix of like managed policies and unmanaged policies. The other thing is I have Identity Center going, which I also don't usually use, but just a place to manage. Typically, this is where SSO integrations happen, and you're attaching different permission sets to different user groups that are getting synced with Okta or Active Directory. And so all of those different pieces of it are around the lay of the land for this account. And to use, to go through a little bit of like history of how Access Analyzer came to be, this was really like the first place when I was building a product in this area. The way a lot of early CSPMs worked was creating this credentials report. And so this was a system where essentially it's the same thing that's on the dashboard, but vendors would use this and turn it into like a UI for people. And so this is all of the user accounts that are in there. It's basically the same information that was on the user's page, but with a little more detail of like when the access key was last rotated, if it's active or not, and when it was last used. And over time, different pieces of the dashboard have gotten better at showing that. The problem is just doing a sort by like, if I have when an access key was last used, doesn't really solve the key issue with turning this stuff off, which is the fear that rises inside as you're about to deactivate an access key and you don't know what it does. And so, for example, this external account that I have access to, I don't know if it's still necessary. There's a lot of times the security team doesn't have the context to know, like, the important information here is who made this account, why did they make it, why does it exist, how do I use it? And that information just doesn't exist in the console because all we have is, hey, here's the last time it was used. And so typically the workflow that I've seen from most organizations doing this is to just come in the security credentials and then deactivating the key. And typically there's not much better than a scream test for this. And the fear is that a lot of companies have roles or access keys that might exist for like emergency services, or if a DevOps alert happens and the team needs to get in and access a privileged account that they don't usually access. But there's always this fear that in an emergency or there's some key piece of the application that hasn't triggered in a long time, we need something better than just going based off like when was the last time this happened to actually feel comfortable going in and deactivating the key. And so for a lot of organizations, they just never do this. And I think the hard, yeah.
Yeah, just a little anecdotal story here, just to add a little color. So when I first started here, those many years ago, you know, we had this capability in our core platform to actually go and delete the identity or the access key. And, you know, you called out that fear perfectly. And so folks have a reference point. We had a customer that we were working with back then, and we uncovered a bunch of these things that you see right here in James's screen, a bunch of dormant identities with keys. And we had identified one that hadn't been used in 6 months. And sure enough, they used our tool to delete it, which is exactly what they were supposed to do. Well, a week later, we got a call because this was a retail company that you've all heard of. And they were trying to reconfigure the voice over IP system at their stores. And they couldn't. And it's because it needed one of those identities that we had deleted, one of those access keys. And it was all out panic. And we helped them put it all back together. But long story short, that fear is real. That's the kind of thing that folks have, this paralyzation, I call, that comes across them when they see all of these artifacts that are out there and they just have no clue whether or not they can delete them without their job being put on the line.
Yeah, and that's exactly, it's especially at the code layer where this stuff becomes the most nerve-wracking and the most complicated and also the most like potentially catastrophic. For me, a similar example is there was a key that was only used during like a database initialization script. And obviously in our production environment, that only happened once, but the DevOps team got bogged down for a couple of weeks trying to spin up like a warm environment because the initdb script wasn't working because it needed that access key that was only there. And so if we were having a real recovery situation, we would have been totally hosed had I deleted that key instead of just deactivating it. And so this is just the kind of normal thing that happens where you combine that with the real compliance requirement where like this password age being what it is and this last activity, if I was going for like a SOC 2 certification or something, like this is an immediate red flag to the auditor. And it doesn't help that it's so easy to spot in the GUI, right? Like your GUIs probably, if you let's say I've seen a lot of GUIs that are just full of red exclamation points of over 1-year-old access keys. And it's hard because of the compliance requirement behind it, combined with the stress of deactivating it. It really creates a lot of pain around figuring out what you're going to do. And I remember when Access Analyzer first got announced, I thought, finally, this is going to be the thing that allows me to finally solve this problem. But I think what I really missed is I thought, and I think it's intuitive to a lot of security people, to think that the core issue here is like a visibility issue, where it's like, what if I saw like what resource it was last used on, and then what things that resource could access? And you think about all these products that create these like beautiful graphs of like who can access what thing. But the problem was never like, here's what this identity can theoretically do. The problem has always been the business context of why that identity exists in the first place. And that's something that no SaaS tool can give you, which is the flip side of like trying to solve this problem from this perspective, from a SaaS tools, is like ultimately it's a business problem of I need to know why James created this Aurora username. And I'm the only one that knows that. And if I ever like quit this company or move on, right, like no one's going to know why that account exists. And it continues to just proliferate this problem. But regardless, we can still go into and see what Access Analyzer can do here and some of the things that are neat about it. Because there are some things that are genuinely helpful and neat about it. I just don't think it's a scalable way to really solve this problem compared to like what Sonri's doing, for example. And first, when you set it up, the other thing I'll say is I've never cared about pricing before, but now that this is actually my personal AWS account, I care about it. And Access Analyzer is like kind of expensive. It's if you have an account with like 1,000 users on it, like it's not cheap to run these scans across all of that account. And then obviously most people have accounts that are way bigger than that. And really like it's a hefty, noticeable piece of the budget here that's happening behind the scenes. But I'll leave that for a different piece. And really, there's two kinds of analyzers that you can have when you create them. The first is the external access analysis. And this is sort of interesting data, which I think it's helpful to turn on just to see it. But I don't know what to do with it besides it being interesting. Like it's just interesting stuff to have. And we'll talk briefly about that. But then this unused access analyzer is the piece of setting the tracking period. And what's interesting about this is you can't change this once you set it. So just be cognizant of that. And this will be how many days an access key goes unused before it shows up in the console. And then just setting if we want it for the organization or if we want it for the account access. Yeah, these are just the two kinds. It's a very simple creation process, setup process. And so first, just briefly to talk about the external access. This is kind of interesting because it's showing me all of my roles that I've created. And you can see here all of the finest vendors in the business that I've created different test cross-account roles with, and letting me know the access level piece here. And I view this analyzer, just super briefly, as like it's really useful for compliance teams doing like third-party risk stuff, and to discover if you have, oh shoot, I didn't know that we had a role that was connecting to this other vendor. Like, what's that about? The hard part here is, once again, the problem exists of not telling me, like, beyond the name of the role, why that exists or what it's doing. So some of this like federated user stuff, it's still really difficult to tell, like, why does this exist? And if I go into the finding, there's really not a lot here. You know, this is a default AWS role getting created to do the SAML relationships, but it's also getting flagged by access analyzers and external access. And so this is part of why no one takes like automated actions based on these findings, because it's too easy to just foot gun yourself with deleting something you don't want to do. But hopping into the unused analyzer piece, here we have some things that are helpful compared to just looking at the list of users and roles. The first is just getting the role data in a way, is the first useful piece. But then the other piece is the getting the access keys as separate findings. And so here I had that demo admin account that I believe actually has data going to it, or it has been used. So if I just look at the high level, I know it's the inactive one. Yeah, so like this admin account instead. Here, the last activity is 5 days ago. But what it's picking up on is just what I would normally have to scroll over to see, which is that the active key here was last used 5 days ago. But then there's probably a second key on it that was last used 307 days ago. And so this is another reason why using this is kind of annoying, is, okay, I found it, but then there's no like linking to the access key itself. I just have to like click in and then go to the security credentials and then figure out which one it's talking about. And then I can go and deactivate. But even now, this is a live account. At some point, this was using DymoDB. Like, I'm kind of scared to turn this off, but I will for demo purposes. And then like many people who do this, I now have to go and frantically go, oh God, did I just break something? And then just hope that I didn't. Let me log in real quick here. And this is the fear part of what everyone goes through with this stuff.
It is, and it's, just another bit of context. This is a great representative of what we see at a massive scale, James. We're working with one company right now. They're a large financial. They have over 50,000 unused person and non-person identities across 850 accounts. Right now we're in one account on your side, right? And you just have to multiply that exponentially. And
one account of a company with one employee with one application.
Yes. And it's just I think that it's super important that people realize that, you're like, can I delete this, or can I archive this, or can I deactivate it? Okay, now what did I go break with this one? And then try and imagine a team that has to worry about that with 50,000, and tomorrow you got 50,001. It's a daunting task. And like you said, people just throw their hands in the air at some point.
Yeah. And honestly, I think there is a real risk calculus that's underlying their decision to do that, which is like, me deactivating that key is probably riskier than the fact that key exists somewhere, or at least it existed somewhere for something at some point. But I have secret scanning in my repo, and so I'm not afraid that it's in my code. And so it's this risk calculus of like, deactivating that was probably a riskier decision than leaving it.
As far as impacting the business,
yeah. And I think that's the struggle security teams get into, is when you layer in, like, for me, that's the case. But if you layer in like a compliance requirement, like, I have no choice but to do it. And that's where the calculus gets really difficult. And so I mean, basically I could do that for all of these, but the other thing I want to highlight is it gets even more complicated when you think about edge cases here, where we're thinking about things like roles that were used one time to do something within AWS. So like this OIDC provider role, this I believe was spun up as part of using EKS control to create the Kubernetes cluster in the first place, which is a command line utility for EKS. And there's all sorts of service to service AWS roles that get spun up in the background when you create different services. You turn them on for the first time, and then no one goes and uses it. So you turned on the satellite service, which is always my favorite example of a service no one knows about because it's like a very weird thing you can do, like buying satellite time. But you turn on services, they create all these cross-account roles, and then depending on if they're ever used again, it's really hard to tell if they exist. And then beyond this, it's also not addressing my real risk in some ways because it's not interpreting the context of the identity center on top of it. So if you think about how this would look for most people's environments that have SSO turned on, is you have all of these users and groups that you're importing from different places, from Okta probably, or Active Directory probably, and those accounts are then accessing roles on your backend. And the thing you actually want to know is like, hey, does James still need access to the admin role that he has? But that's not just looking at the logs of the admin role or seeing what roles are still used is not going to really help you figure out, does this account need to exist or not? Specifically, like that James account, I've never actually logged into or anything, but it doesn't show up here as a finding, even though I should probably get rid of it. And it's just those kinds of edge cases that make it so that Access Analyzer, like if you tunnel vision on this way of approaching the identity issue, you'll probably even end up spending a lot of time on not your biggest risk issues because it's also not necessarily telling you the full story of how your identities are all connecting to each other. So with those things out of the way, and we've talked about the scariness, there's this other piece here that's also interesting, and it's a very similar parallel to the Access Analyzer piece in that it sounds really good in theory, but it's also actually not super helpful. And I had let this load earlier today, but it's reloading it, which takes some time. But essentially all this does is tell you all of the services that have been accessed by this account. And so you can see how AWS is trying to push their permissions model in here, which would be attaching SCPs to this account to then say, hey, here's all of the services that are used by this account, and I can just deny all of the services that aren't used by this account. But you can see here, it's not quite that simple because CloudTrail, for example, this is the last time that I've changed a CloudTrail configuration in here. But obviously I don't want to turn off logging for this account by denying CloudTrail, or I don't want to make it so no one can come in and fix things. And so once again, even trying to use this to like create SCPs becomes really problematic for doing deny all sort of activities. And so to answer the other question that came up around like how is Sonri actually deployed and addressing these compliance requirements, I think Jeff, this is probably a good time to hand it over to you to talk about like this SCP orchestration piece is something that's totally missing both from Access Analyzer and is really hard to do yourself. So I've managed SCPs before. And it was this big manual thing where we had Terraform that deployed them, but we couldn't deploy it with our normal Terraform. So we had to like run it locally, which was its own issue. And there were these big custom maintained and custom crafted policies where the SCPs become sort of this tangled mess of AWS permissions that can happen. And then they're never really accomplishing what they set out to accomplish, which was providing some sort of guardrails around what's possible. So I think, Jeff, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Awesome. Yeah. Let's see if I can share my screen now. We'll pick up right there. All right. There's the window abyss, which is good. All right. So here, I'll blow this up. So James is absolutely right. So SCPs, well, it's not working, but that's fine. We'll just go with this. SCPs, and this is an example of an SCP. Why is this doing this? Sorry. Give me a second. This is when you know it's a live demo, when you get signed out of G Suite. All right. Maybe I can blow it up now. There we go. All right. Take a look at this this box in the middle, right? So AWS did create this capability called SCPs, which is short for Service Control Policies. And what they want you to do through that recommendation that James was just showing you is they want you to go write these policies. And this is an SCP again. And these policies, they not only control service access across the entire organization or different scopes, they also control access to regions. And you kind of get, two different controls in one single capability here. But what we have learned over the years is that this is not only very manual and very time consuming. What we're seeing more and more is that it's dangerous. If you don't know what you're doing and you're deploying SCPs, and if you're trying to change existing SCPs at different scopes, you could, not do harm to the business, so to speak, but you could have some serious business interruptions. We're working with a company that just went through this a couple of weeks ago. They are talking to us about using the firewall instead of doing it by hand. They still had a project that they needed to do by hand with a deadline to control AWS Bedrock, which is one of their new and upcoming emerging AI services. And sure enough, they were not aware of the way that the SCPs were going to react as it relates to inheritance and propagation. And they caused all kinds of service disruption to different business units. So,
Jeff, if I can hop in real quick there too, like just in my experience, the other issue is like trying to troubleshoot if it's an SCP. The first time it's an SCP blocking something, it's really hard to tell because it depends on where you're logging it, what's blocking it, how those logs are coming in. It's not surfaced to developers at all. And then what's funny about something like that is the first time someone has a really painful experience where they're like, why isn't this working? They finally realize after like a week or two that it was an SCP blocking it. Then all of a sudden, everything becomes the SCP's fault. And then you're just getting these questions nonstop. That's like, oh, is this the SCP? Is this the SCP? Do we need to check this? And it's just, it really opens this other permissions nightmare thing.
Well, it does. And, it's funny because I said those slides, but I love this. So if you look on the left side of this slide, that's an example of a least privilege policy. That's the other problem, right? If you're focusing on every single identity, you're focused on every single, one that's being used, but it's over permissioned, you have to right size it. These are screenshots from Access Analyzer, like, James has been showing you. But the truth is, it doesn't matter if you're using Access Analyzer for this visibility, or if you're using your CNAP or your CSPM, Prisma Cloud, Wiz, the list goes on, Orca. They're all visibility tools. And that was something super important that James called out when we started this talk, was you're looking at tooling right now, this landscape that shows this risk, that just shows you a bunch of things that, frankly, I know, James, you'll agree with me, folks are just staring at. They're just staring at the problem. And I think that, the question from the viewers, how is this different? This is fundamentally different. There's nothing out there today that does what Sunry's doing to actually help flip this kind of mindset of getting to least privilege today over on its head, and give folks a way where they can actually get to least privilege and be successful at it quickly, but most importantly, safely. So with that segue, I'm going to go ahead and show folks a little bit of the Sunry Cloud Permissionless Firewall. We are super proud of this. And this is a live demo system. And what we do is we really, really attack the pain right now of the entire world of trying to fix what James just showed you by hand. And what we do is we focus on this vast part of the public cloud and of AWS in this scenario that's unused, okay? The vast majority of that mess is unused identities, unused permissions, and unused portions of the cloud, whether it's services or regions. And that really, believe it or not, those four things make up IAM, all right? And what we do with the firewalls, we plug in very quickly, and we are able to expose this part of the cloud that is unused but turned on, all right? and we bubble it down into 4 primary data points, right? You have, in this demo system, 122 over-permissioned identities. You have 94 unused identities. We call those zombies. And we have 127 unused services and 17 unused regions. It's not that different than what James showed you. The problem is whether or not you're trying to use IAM Access Analyzer or the other tooling, when it comes to actually taking action, that's where their stories start to crumble. Like you saw there in Access Analyzer, it's great for visibility, but if you wanted to right size a role or right size an identity and get it to least privilege, you got to go do that by hand, hundreds and thousands of times. And if you wanted to disable the services or turn off the regions, you got to go write those service control policies by hand. Not only do you have to do that, and you have to run the risk of breaking things and the manual effort and how long it takes, but they're inflexible. So you got to go. It just becomes a big, headache. And the folks that are using this firewall, it's really interesting because we are really, really helping them offload this pain point. No more manual policy writing, no more SCP writing, but yet you can really, really start to attack this surface area. So, the first thing that we do is we show you that you've got these over-permissioned users, right? And what we focus on is, and I'll open up EC2 here. And by the way, this kind of looks like a firewall, right? Instead of ports, we're focusing on services and permissions. But we come in with a default deny, which is really, really cool. And what we've learned is by securing the hub, all the spokes get impacted, right? And that's how we can remove big chunks of risk quickly with the firewall. But what we do is we focus not just on every permission. You can see here that EC2, for instance, it's got hundreds of permissions inside EC2, as most of us know, but there's only about 43 that actually could do harm to the business if used inadvertently by infrastructure as code, by Terraform, by a junior admin. Bottom line is not all permissions are created equal. If you think about EC2, you might have 200 people or 200 identities or 200 roles or keys that have access to EC2. But do all 200 need access to delete every VPC, to delete the NAT gateways, to create brand new ingress, egress points? No, they don't. As a matter of fact, those are permissions that should be guarded, put under lock and key.
And that's Jeff, real quick, just to highlight one of those examples is like the attach internet gateway. Like that's something that only like one Terraform role maybe should have the permissions to do in an environment. But like to your point, there's no reason users need to be able to like make an internet gateway facing service.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned disable CloudTrail. What if you have permission to turn CloudTrail logging off? That's not good. Why would you want that, right? Why would you? What we found, James, is over the years with the customers that we've worked with is that they just leave these entitlements out there and they give these identity star permissions to EC2.
Well, it's too hard. Yeah, I mean, because it's way easier to give our DevOps team has EC2 power user is a way easier way to conceptualize it than, every single person has their,
Well, and totally. So what we do is we plug in and we figure out who's using these, right? Like in this particular environment, there's 50 identities that have access to it. How many are using one of those sensitive permissions? None, right? Well, maybe in this environment, how many are using it? This sandbox? Well, there's 2, okay? Bottom line is the vast majority of the folks that have access to these sensitive permissions don't need it. So what the firewall is able to do is we come in and we protect it. And what this protection does is it basically says that everything that needs to be out in that environment can be out there, but we're going to right size it. We're going to get it to least privilege on the permissions that matter. And we're going to keep them from using those sensitive permissions. Now, the identities that do need them, we recommend them as exemptions here so that we don't break anything. Where you put your build roles, your break glass accounts, your Terraform stuff, those kinds of things. And so that they can go ahead and do their thing and, they have the permissions that they need. But you've removed that whole landscape of risk in important parts of your cloud, and you're able to get them to least privilege with just a single click, not having to go push out 50 least privilege policies. And trust me, as you know, when it comes to production environments, this number is massive versus the actual identities that are using those sensitive permissions. But we account for, someone's going to need one of those permissions, or a job or a role is going to need access to one of those permissions further on down. So, and this addresses the issue that I mentioned where least privilege policies and SCPs are inflexible. Okay, they're going to break things tomorrow. So what we do is we have this really clever capability inside the firewall that we call permissions on demand that grants these entitlements back to identities as they need them to go do their job. Think about that access key that I told you about for the voice over IP application, right? We could have just said you don't need to, that particular permission or whatever. And in this scenario, I'm going to show you what it looks like. So I'm going to come into EC2. I'm going to pop into a security group, and I'm going to try and create a brand new ingress RDP role. That is a sensitive permission. I'm using the cloud right now, and this account is Sneaky Jeff. Sneaky Jeff is not an exemption. What happens? You get blocked. James, I'm so glad that you brought up the SCPs not showing folks why they're getting blocked. Okay? Because what happens with the firewall is we see this the moment that it gets blocked, and instead of this resulting in Jira tickets and ServiceNow tickets and days of troubleshooting and impacting the business, in real time, what happened is we have a Slack app and we have a Microsoft Teams app for summary, and it said, that Sneaky Jeff was just denied access to try and do this. Now, I could send that to Sneaky Jeff directly, who can self-justify whether or not he truly needs it, and that's fine. Then it would come to me as the approver. In this scenario, it went straight to me as the approver, and I can say, that's fine, do your job, it's all good. Sneaky Jeff's going to get a message saying, hey, it's all good, and then bang, you were able to grant that permission back. Jeff can come back in, retry, good to go. You broke nothing, the business was not impacted, and you were able to grant this permission back, and you can grant these entitlements back to these individuals or roles, either temporarily or make it a permanent exemption in the system. But it really ensures that the firewall is able to flex with the business, as the business might need these entitlements back, but that entire period of time, the risk with that permission being used on that identity was removed. And then we've got the next couple of use cases here, and I am looking at the clock, but I want to make sure that we call out zombies. This is my absolute favorite, James, and this is the unused part of the cloud when it comes to identities. And these are I call this cyber litter, cyber garbage. These are all the artifacts that are left behind from teams past, from projects past. And this is I mentioned the one financial that we're working with over 50,000 of these. This number is 50,000 in their firewall tenant, and they know that there's no way they will ever be able to remove them one by one. With the firewall, we flip things around on its head, and we say, you don't have to go delete 94 identities. You don't have to go research them. We know that's going to take weeks, if not months, and the problem's just going to keep remanifesting. We're going to quarantine them. The firewall has a technology in it that is going to put them in identity jail. It is magnificent. Instantly, all of the risk with those 94 identities being used goes away, but we don't delete anything. And if I preview them here, you can kind of see that we've got a nice mixture of person and non-person identities in this demo system that haven't been used in 5 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year plus, right? All we do is click quarantine, and all that risk goes away. And we know that we don't want to break anything, right? This is that voice over IP application. And what happens is if one of these identities wakes up and attempts to use any permission, it's going to trigger a permissions on demand request. And we say that you can't use those entitlements unless the firewall does. And it's going to send that permissions on demand request to an approver who can let that zombie wake up either for an hour or however long it needs to do its job. But maybe that identity is only needed for a report once a year, once a quarter. But all that time in between its usage, there's no risk with it sitting out there because the firewall was protecting its entitlements. And what if it woke up and it wasn't supposed to? Well, that's a new indicator of compromise that you got in the firewall blocked it, which is a super, super cool use case. And then the last two parts here, that's really attacking those service control policies, the 127 unused services and the 17 regions. It's interesting because these may not be the most exciting part of talking about the firewall, but these are definitely the most exciting part that resonate with the customers, because this is attacking the pain point of writing SCPs by hand today, tomorrow, indefinitely, breaking things. This allows you to offload all of the risk and allows you to do all of that with just a single button. You preview the services that aren't being used at any particular scope and you just disable them. You do the same thing with regions. You turn the regions that you want on, and the ones off, and it's instant. So bottom line is this is a really cool capability that we're excited about because it's the first time in period. There's no competitor here where you're able to actually do and accomplish the things that all this other tooling that's out there today from a visibility perspective is showing you have to go do by hand. So hopefully that gives folks a good idea of what we're able to do for them with the Cloud Permissions Firewall. Yes, this helps with compliance and everything else where you must prove that you're adhering and trying to get to least privilege. But James, I'm going to stop sharing, and then let's see if we've got some questions that have come in.
I'm excited. Sorry, I'm excited for Jesse's question about how it works under the hood, because I don't know how much I know I could share, but I'd probably overshare, and I'm probably not allowed to share all that stuff. And so I want to let you answer that.
So let's see. So does this then rewrite the IAM policy or create a new one and then assign that to the role? Okay, excellent question. No, we are not assigning policies to roles. We are not assigning managed policies. We're not assigning inline policies. We are trying to get the world out of that mess of maintaining the spokes, right? We are focusing on the hub. When you focus on the hub, everything else falls in line, right? Without revealing a little too much of the secret sauce, like James said, it is a clever multi-level orchestration mechanism that we put in place in AWS using the cloud native controls themselves. But we do it in a way that allows us to not get into problems with SCP limitations. It allows us to leverage SCPs, customer managed policies. We even do a level of ABAC with attributes, right? But no, we're not having to push out policies. And that's the beautiful thing, is it's not manipulating individual policies on every single little identity. It's much more scalable, much more elegant than that. Great question. What else have we got?
Yeah, here we go. We've got a good one from Paul. Jeff, this sounds like it's one for you. I'll give you a second to read it.
How does Sunray Security distinguish between legitimate service accounts and orphan identities as well as shadow IT accounts? Yeah, so what we do is we've got incredible analytics. That's one thing that we've done a great job of, as we've been showing people this problem for all these years, is we've got multiple patents that we've had for many years on least privilege analytics. So when we plug in, we do a retrospective look back on your cloud for the last 180 days of CloudTrail, not to mention multiple years worth of API-based metadata that we're able to take a look at when we do our discovery. That gives us a really, really clear picture and landscape of what's been orphaned and what's actually being used. Anything that's being used and has been used in any recent period of time, we're going to recommend that as an exemption in the firewall. Everything else, we're going to populate it and track it as a zombie, right? And recommend that it be quarantined by the firewall or right-sized to least privileged by the firewall. And then anything related to shadow IT is we're going to be able to show you where these different identities are at different scopes, at different regions. Things leveraging services that you did not realize were being used in different environments. That's always a big eye-opener to folks. And it does. That's a great use case for us at shadow IT. We also talk about sometimes, I know it sounds far-fetched, but denial of wallet attacks, where things can get spun up in dark parts of your cloud, regions that you weren't aware of, and then you guys get a terrible bill next month that unfortunately you have to pay. But that's a very good question. What else have we got, Matt?
That sure is. Yep. We've got a good one from James here, concerned about audit trails. I'll throw it up here on the screen.
How does somebody maintain audit trails for actions taken on sensitive data and resources? What level of detail is captured? So our primary source of telemetry is CloudTrail. Okay. So we're constantly, we're event driven. We've always been event driven here at Sunray. We're not just, mining and hammering your APIs or anything like that. And that allows us to build a model for every single permission that's out there being used by every single one of these person and non-person identities. And, that allows us to do some really neat things, not today. And James, you'll love this, but tomorrow, because we can say, this service was being used, but guess what? The business quit using it. It hasn't been used in 90 days. Do you want to turn it off? And let's go. We're going to recommend that to you. And you may have quarantined 122 zombies today, but in 30 days, we're going to let you know you got another 5 or 6. Do you want us to go into quarantine this for you too? So it's really, really good for ongoing governance, our ability to constantly mine, the activity out there. So people don't think it's just a one and done. This is a continuous thing that we're going to help you kind of govern with the Cloud Permissions Firewall.
Yeah, and I was going to highlight during the demo too, like the workflow piece that you showed is pretty magical to me, as far as like, that's the core problem, is first of all, knowing that someone is even getting blocked, but typically they have like you showed it in a 2-second part of a demo, but the normal experience is like, I'm being blocked. What's blocking me? Let me spend 2 hours trying to figure that out. When I think it's security's fault, I have to post in their Slack channel, and then I have to wait for, a day or a week for someone to get back to me. Then we're troubleshooting together for an hour. Like, it's this whole crazy process when, the Slack message told you in 2 seconds what was going on.
It does the same thing, by the way, James, if for any disabled services. So let's just say that you disable light sale across your entire organization. If I log in right now and I try and just open up light sale, like search in from the console, the command line, whatever, try and go to it, you're going to get an access denied all over that dashboard. The moment you try and access it, it's actually going to let you know. It's going to send you a Slack or a Teams message saying that the cloud permissions firewall blocked you. You need to go talk to your cloud permissions firewall administrator. So we've done a lot of thought and effort into try and make sure that folks aren't confused, that they don't understand why they were blocked by an SCP or whatever that might be. So that chat ops capability, it does a great job of communicating to those individuals that are getting denied as well. And it all happens in real time. It's very slick.
Yeah, and it solves the problem too of every organization I've been a part of has like an architecture approval process for different services to get approved. But when you're dealing with like large internationally dispersed teams, like you can't expect every single person to know the exact things they're supposed to be doing. And like when an account is called sandbox, developers typically expect that it's a sandbox, meaning that I can do literally anything in it. And so it's a way to actually enforce and educate about the policies of like, oh, hey, here's this new AWS service that just came out. Like, do we want to use this? And you can actually start the conversation on day one instead of waiting until, the dev team has created an entire architecture already. And then they're asking like, okay, can we push this to production now? But you're actually able to get informed early on in the process.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Well, Matt, do we want to go ahead and pick a winner? Because I'm watching the clock and I know some folks probably got a break here at the top of the hour.
Yep, we sure do. We're getting close to it. Yeah, guys, I'll give it to y'all. There's been a lot of great questions that came in, but Jeff, James, whichever one was calling your name, feel free to announce it and we'll award them a Nintendo Switch.
I want Jeff. I'm gonna put deny blame over to Sonri on this one. I'm not taking any Latio hurt feelings on this.
All right, so there's some good questions. I'm just reviewing the ones we talked about. There's some other ones as well, but I got to pick one. So I like the question about us at maintaining audit trails and how we track sensitive data and resources. So James McKenzie, congratulations. You win the Nintendo Switch. Lots of great questions, though, so I appreciate everyone participating. That's super, super awesome.
I would have been biased too, picking a James. So
Wonderful. Thank you all, everybody. We'll have the recording afterwards. We'll send an email here today and two so that you can access it or share it with colleagues. Want to thank you all again and be on the lookout for the next Unreal Security webinar. Thank you all. Have a good one.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.